So why on earth then, if the four Gospels were truly anonymous in the first century as skeptics claim, would the second generation of Christians give them such boring names? Jesus of Nazareth is the most significant figure in all of human history. But most of what we know about him traces back to four ancient biographies called Gospels, which you'll find at the start of the New Testament. But where do they come from? Well, the traditional answer has been that the first and fourth evangelists, Matthew and John respectively, were themselves apostles of Jesus. Matthew, also going by the name Levi, was a former tax collector turned disciple. And John the son of Zebedee, himself a fisherman, was then welcomed into Jesus' inner circle of 3 disciples. The other two Gospels are traditionally ascribed to friends of an apostle. Mark, or John Mark, who hosted early church leaders in his Jerusalem home, he later became a companion of Paul and Peter, and his Gospel is said to record Peter's apostolic preaching. Then there's Luke, a Greek physician and traveling companion of Paul on his missionary journeys. His Gospel is said to record eyewitness testimony carefully collected from sources who knew Jesus firsthand. Skeptical scholars like Bart Ehrman, however, question the legitimacy of this traditional authorship, arguing that the original Gospels were entirely anonymous, and that later, as an example of ancient pseudonym or forgery, the Christian communities who did not know who wrote the Gospels stuck the four traditional names on them in a bid to garner apostolic credibility. So what does the evidence say about these biographers of the Christian story? Who wrote the Gospels? Well, the skeptical claim that no one really knows who wrote the Gospels, it isn't anything new, and it didn't start with Bart Ehrman. The Manichaean thinker Faustus used that line of argument in 400 AD in order to cast doubt on the credibility of the Gospels. But just as Augustine answered Faustus in his own day, responding to doubts by pointing out the facts, let me lay out some reasons why I reject the idea that the Gospels were ever truly anonymous, making the case for why you can take traditional authorship seriously. First, the unanimous ancient testimony of the Church Fathers. Go back to the earliest Christian voices in the generations after Jesus, and they all universally affirm traditional authorship. Let's start with Papias of Hierapolis, who was born in 60 AD and likely knew the Apostle John personally. Although his work only survives by being quoted by the later chronicler Eusebius, Papias wrote right around the turn of the 2nd century, where he specifically attributed the four Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, notably detailing how Mark recorded Peter's testimony. Following on from Papias, we have Irenaeus of Lyon, Clement of Alexandria, Origen of Alexandria, Tertullian, and the anonymous Muratorian fragment, another 5 sources within the first 2 centuries after Jesus' resurrection, who all show independence from the details that they offer, but who all universally affirm Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the traditional authors of the Gospels. Contrast that with the book of Hebrews, a New Testament book that everyone agrees is genuinely anonymous. Within the first few centuries, the early church fathers suggested a host of potential authors, from Paul to Apollos to Barnabas. It's such a mess, leaving Origen to comment into this controversy that only God knows who wrote Hebrews. You see, a genuinely anonymous book led to competing traditions about authorship in the early church. But when it comes to the Gospels, in the first 3 centuries, there is not a single doubt or deviation from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which suggests perhaps that the Gospels were never truly anonymous. Second, we have no anonymous copies of the Gospels. While Ehrman makes the claim that the Gospels were originally circulated without names on them, dating right back to the 2nd century AD, every early manuscript fragment that we have that either includes the beginning or end of a Gospel actually has a title that identifies the traditional authors, according to Luke or according to John. But were the originals themselves anonymous? I mean, perhaps the church has added on these names before Papias wrote and before the copies that we do have today were penned. But another reason to doubt this idea that the Gospels were ever truly anonymous is that, apart from John, the other 3 names make for terrible forgeries. And take the Gnostic Gospels, for example. When these Gospels were penned 150 to 300 years after Jesus, the authors forged famous signatures, giving them apostolic names from the 1st century in order to make them go viral. Names like the Gospel of Peter or Thomas or Mary or Judas, names Christians want to hear from. A close parallel would be like me writing in 2023 about the American Civil War, but marketing the book as though Abraham Lincoln wrote it, and all in a bid to drum up sales. That's how forgeries worked. So why on earth then, if the 4 Gospels were truly anonymous in the 1st century as skeptics claim, would the second generation of Christians give them such boring names? If the goal was establishing credibility, why choose Matthew, a source tainted by being a treasonous tax collector? Why choose Mark, a B-list non-apostle with a history of ministry failure, rather than just calling it Peter's Gospel? Or why choose Luke, a cultural outsider who had no direct experience of Jesus? If the goal was forgery, then these names weaken rather than strengthen the credibility of the Gospels compared to other live options. So the humble names we do have on the Gospels, far from indicating creative forgery, are far more in line with honest reportage. Which leads to the third and final point. The Gospels have internal clues as to who wrote them that line up with the traditional authors. While the Gospels don't exactly spell out the name of their author like Paul does in his letters, honestly, that's relatively standard for ancient biography. Third person was a typical way of speaking of yourself, as we see in other ancient writers like Julius Caesar, Josephus, or Xenophon. Even still, if you carefully analyze the text of the Gospels, there are a series of literary features used by the authors to hint at their true identity. Isn't it curious that in Matthew's Gospel, you see a preoccupation with financial details, a feature befitting a former tax collector, alongside offering more detailed stories in places where Matthew is present? Isn't it curious how in Mark's Gospel it opens and closes by mentioning the Apostle Peter, almost like an inclusio, identifying the source of Mark's content, which is fitting for Mark as Peter's apostolic amanuensis? And isn't it curious that in Luke's Gospel, on the first page, the author admits to not being an eyewitness, but then spotlights key names along the way while leaving others anonymous, in order to hint towards his sources? Or that the style of his Greek hints at an elite Greek education, like with a Gentile physician? Or how in the book of Acts, volume 2 to Luke's Gospel, you see it switch from third person to first person in places where Luke became present. The hints are all there, especially in John's Gospel, where the author is not named but rather referenced as the beloved disciple, a figure we readily identify as John, the son of Zebedee. To me, it seems refreshing that unlike the Gnostic Gospels, the authors of the canonical Gospels aren't clamoring for the spotlight. They are relatively casual about their authorship because rather than leaning into their own authority, instead they simply spotlight the colossal figure of Jesus. But given the unanimous voice of the early church and our earliest manuscripts, along with the evidence in the text, there is no good reason to believe that the Gospels were ever truly anonymous, and plenty of evidence to accept the traditional story of authorship, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the four evangelists that stand behind the Gospels that bear their name. Dan here from Questioning Christianity. Thanks so much for checking us out. We are all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. So if you're enjoying the content, make sure you subscribe and click the bell on YouTube, and then go ahead and follow us on socials.